Welcome, everyone. We are very delighted you are joining us today. We're going to wait just a couple of moments as there's a few more people that are in the process of joining us. So please take a moment to relax and we'll begin shortly. Thank you. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are waiting for just a few more people to join us. So we'll be just a few moments and we'll be starting our webinar for today. Please feel free to use the chat box to share that you are joining us today and which foundation you are representing.
Tracy, I see that Ruth has joined us.
Right.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Apologies for, I just had some technical difficulties there.
Wonderful, Ruth, thank you. We're just waiting just a moment and then we're going to get started, so thank you. Okay, I see that we're just about 3 minutes after the hour, and recognizing we have a full schedule today, I'd like to get started. Again, thank you for joining us for the Institutional Change and Understanding Unconscious Bias webinar. This is one of our ongoing series for Communities for Gender Equality. My name is Tracy Babrick, co-director of Learning and Network Engagement with Community Foundations of Canada, and I'm joined by my colleagues Cindy Lindsay and Amanda Watkins. As a national organization, Community Foundations of Canada operates across the lands traditionally known as Turtle Island. The first community foundation in Canada was founded and established in 1921 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on Treaty 1 territory. While our staff finds itself working remotely across 5 different provinces, it is easy to forget that while we may not meet each other or reside with each other on the same lands, but we operate with a shared direction of our work, which is grounded in the physical territory that we currently know as Canada. And our work is influenced and affected by the various communities within which our staff live, reside, and share. Today, I'm connecting with you from my home in Grand Prairie, Alberta, which is Treaty 8 territory on the traditional lands of the Métis, Kelly Lake Métis Settlement Society, and the Beaver First Nation. I am grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8, and I'm continuing to learn more about how I can be a better friend to our Indigenous communities and share this journey with the people who first settled these lands. So a couple of Zoom reminders as we get started today is that you can see us and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So we encourage you to use the chat box for your questions and thoughts as we move through today's webinar. This session is scheduled for 90 minutes and is offered in both English and French, and you can access your preferred language in the language area at the bottom right of your screen. We will start with our presentation and then move into a 20-minute question and answer period. And to ensure you have the best experience, we encourage you to use the gallery view. Today's topic is a continued conversation on gender equality, and it's part 1 of a 2-part series on institutional change and how the journey is personal, professional, and institutional. At this session, we will reflect on existing cultures and power dynamics and share tools for reimagining leadership, cultural structure, and also changes within our organization to build inclusive community foundations. Apologize, I just was going to try and move my screen forward. There we go. Following this session, we will be hosting the recording on our website, so you'll be welcome to reflect back on our learnings today and share with others within your organizations. We are delighted today to present this webinar in partnership with Ruth Mojeed, who is the Chief Equity Officer from the Inclusion Project. Ruth is the founder and CEO of the Inclusion Project. Ruth brings extensive lived experience and grounded expertise in her work in racial equality, diversity, and inclusion. Her research and solutions design focuses on intersectional and intergenerational approach to address complex issues of race, decolonization, and gender equality. She leads organizational EDI strategy development and coaching among multi-level stakeholders in public and private sectors, including finance, tech, nonprofit, media, academia, among others. Ruth is Indigenous to the Yoruba tribe from Western Nigeria, and she migrated to Canada in 2015 to pursue a master's degree in intercultural and international communications at Royal Roads. She is a director with the National Board of the Canadian International Council, which she leads efforts on inclusion policy development, and is a director on the Board of Excellence Canada. As well, she supports other regional boards, committees, and advisors, and conducts immense research as well to help to support communities and organizations. Today, Ruth is joined by Jennifer DeBues, who is the co-executive director of the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough, as well as Sara Lyons, who is lead sector engagement of the Equality Fund, and also a member of Community Foundations of Canada team. So Ruth, welcome. It's an honor to be with you today, and I'll pass this webinar over to you to formally introduce our guests and lead us through today's discussion.
Absolutely, Tracy. Thank you very much. Always such a pleasure for me to be sharing space and time, and really thankful too to be joining in today from the unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, where I have the sheer opportunity and unique privilege to be doing life and building relationships and just doing life in general. Thanks, a huge thank you to Jennifer and Sara for making the time to connect this morning, to be present. I'm super excited to hear from you. I know you're both really prepared for this session. I'm excited to learn and to see what are some of the shifts that we are working towards together to start to shift behaviors and start to see the changes that we want to see. Over the next few minutes, just before I get to properly invite our speakers today, Sara and Jennifer, I would just share a few slides from here around some of the initial considerations on our subject matter. And if someone could kindly make me co-host, please.
Amanda, are you able to provide Ruth with co-host there, please?
I've just updated it, so you should be able to access that now.
Awesome. I see. I can do that now. Awesome. I'm just going to be sharing a few slides. As I mentioned, just a few thoughts around the conversation that we're having today on institutional change and the need to understand and address unconscious bias. First off, I like to acknowledge the team on whose permission I am privileged to be reaching out today, to be sharing from today. I work with an organization called the Inclusion Project. We are a social innovation network and resource hub for organizations, communities, and institutions working together to advance knowledge and practice to support and further racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. All of our work essentially is done from a place of intersectionality, and I will be speaking a bit to that later on today. But everything that we do, we understand that race is at the center of it, and that's an area that I will be bringing to our conversation today on gender equality. But I usually like to kind of pause. I think it's also important that we take a minute for us to really get grounded in the conversation and to not just be listeners, or actually to be more or less active listeners, and really to take a minute to reflect and kind of contextualize and travel in our own mind and look through some of our interactions. We're talking about gender equality. Thinking about some of the women that you know to be in leadership. Of course, a conversation such as this today, as I mentioned at the beginning, really super thankful to be sharing space and time with some very strong women. But I'm also really curious to see who's in the room today, and also what communities and what kinds of groups are we representing from our varied lived experiences. So how many women do you know? And we're not doing a poll, it's just for us to do a quick, let's take a minute to think and reflect. How many women of color do you know in leadership, whether as leaders of organizations, community leaders, business leaders, whatever
Ruth, I'll just
it is, whatever categories come to mind readily. How many of them are Indigenous? How many of them are from the LGBTQ plus communities? How many immigrant women do you know? Do you know some of them who are single parents? And there are so many other categorizations that we could kind of draw on today. But all of this just to speak to how deliberately we've got to think around when we meet people, not this single dimension of who anybody is. And also when we're having conversations around gender equality, we also really need to be very clear around what forms of equality we're talking about and to whom those equalities apply.
Ruth,
I heard a quote recently.
Ruth, I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. Your slides are fuzzy, so I'm not sure if you can move to presentation mode, if that would help.
Sorry, could you please say that again?
Okay, your slides are not clear, they're fuzzy, so we just need, if we could move to presentation mode, may it be helpful?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so everyone can see me now?
Yes.
Okay. Would it at all be meaningful to reshare?
Could you try again, please? Yes, that would be wonderful, Ruth. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's still not clear.
Interesting.
Never seen, it's like I'm wearing the wrong person's glasses.
Yes.
That has never happened before.
No, new one.
Okay, okay. So then, technology and how we get to depend on it. I'm sorry, I don't have a magic wand that I would wave and that will put all of the pictures in front of us right now, but I think I just would. The slides I can make available after now, but maybe this is really just going to give us a bit of time to get into the conversation rather than looking at pictures on the screen. But I really wanted to talk on intersectionality and intersectional feminism and things like that, just speaking to the different, acknowledging the different forms of oppression that different groups of women, racialized women, women who are who identify, trans women, women who identify in different ways, some of the multi-layered challenges that they face within the communities that they all represent. And also wanted to take us through some slides on data around COVID and what that is saying about the reality as to where things are. But jumping into the conversation today, I also really want for us to kind of take a moment to think on why we are having a conversation around gender equality in 2021. Why now? What is the urgency? What shifts are happening? It was really refreshing to see some of the questions that came through from participants. It really helped us to know what some of the major areas of interest are for you. And can I just say that's been also impressive, for lack of a better word, to know that some of these conversations are already happening and we are looking for solutions. I should mention that our conversation today, as with any such conversation as this, in 45 minutes, in 90 minutes, in 3 hours even, there's only so much that we're able to cover. So the real work, we're hoping that these conversations today are just a starter. and that the real work begins when you go back from here. We're hoping that some of you would walk away with some imperatives for behavioral change, or even reflections on what needs to shift, and the kind of institutional change that we are really talking about. So I would, at this point, without any further ado, invite Sara and Jen to join me in this conversation. We have heard their bios read. We know that Jen today is joining us as co-executive director at the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough. And Sara is the vice president of the Community Foundations of Canada, and also on secondment with the Equality Fund. Sara, Jen, thank you so much for taking the time this morning.
Great to be here with you.
Thanks, Ruth.
Awesome. And so I will be getting right into it, and that's speaking to really where I kind of started from, around why are we having a conversation around gender equality at this time? Why are we talking about intersections of racism and other forms of inequalities in 2021? Within the context where you're each speaking from, what are some of the things that you've seen that have really prompted us to take a minute to pause and still be having a conversation such as this?
Am I going first?
Yes, please, Sara.
Sure. So I might just start because I have been around the Community Foundation movement for a number of years. And so I suspect I might be a familiar face to a few people. Ruth, you've mentioned it in your introduction, but maybe just say I'm a longtime staff member of Community Foundations of Canada, and in fact worked at the Toronto Foundation, oh boy, about 15 years ago, so a long time ago. And I have an opportunity in 2021 for the calendar year to be on secondment to the Equality Fund. And those of you, I think most of you, but not everyone on the webinar, is participating in the Communities for Gender Equality program, although I know not everyone. And so you might have some familiarity with the Equality Fund. But I just wanted to sort of give a bit of context for kind of how I'm showing up in this space. And I'm particularly excited about this opportunity to work with and for the Equality Fund in 2021 because it is an organization that is explicitly focused on supporting feminist movements and women's rights organizations. So it's entirely focused on feminism and gender equality. It has a very close relationship, as you know, with Community Foundations of Canada. Community Foundations of Canada is one of the collaborative members. And I'm particularly excited because Equality Fund has two things going on that I think are germane to this conversation. One is that it focuses its grant making on women's movements and women's rights organizations, as opposed to uniquely on charities and projects. And so it's really kind of, I would like to say where the puck is going in terms of being a grant maker for change. And secondly, and this will come up later in my comments, because the organization internally in its leadership and in the way it operates is a feminist organization and has done some, but not all, the work of grappling institutionally with how to be an anti-racist and feminist organization. And so I'm learning a lot in that context. Mm-hmm. So to turn to the question, I think it's important to contextualize the year 2020 and into 2021 as an inflection point in a very, very long journey. So while white-led organizations and white leaders are talking about equity, gender, and racism now, it's important to say that some people, and in particular those that have been harmed by these things, have been naming and addressing these things forever, and that their leadership and voices need to continue to be centered. But what has changed recently? I think that while most people would acknowledge that racial and gender discrimination existed and continues to exist, What seems to have shifted is a consciousness that by being passive beneficiaries of white supremacy as white people and as settlers, we're not being actively racist individual and not being actively anti-racist or feminist as individuals and in organizations, we're part of the problem. You know, I was having lunch outside last summer with a friend of mine who also works in the philanthropy sector. And we kind of really grappled with this, like, that was all we had to talk about. You know, what events were we attending? What were we reading? What were we working on? And we did come around to, you know, what's kind of going on here? Why are we talking so much about this? And I think where we came to was that while certainly there had been a passive awareness of these things for a really long time, the feeling of if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem had really emerged. And a feeling that so much of our work in terms of our impact came from our capacity as individuals and as organizations to actively address racism, sexism, patriarchy, etc., rather than just sort of not be perpetrators of those things, had really crystallized.
Thank you, Sara. Jen, do you want to share some opening thoughts? And I really appreciated how Sara just really helped to get things grounded by contextualizing where she's speaking from as well. So if you're able to share some of those perspectives too.
Sure. I've been at the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough for 8 years, and I've pretty much, I actually have done everything involved in running a community foundation, from taking out the recycling to setting up new funds and everything in between. We are a member of the Communities of Gender Equality and really excited about working in that space. And my perspective is definitely a pragmatic, practical. It's a very full life here. And so a lot of my observations and things I'll be sharing will be from the point of view of having daily interactions with the charities in our community, as well as board members and colleagues.
Thanks.
So in terms of the question about why now, why 2021, I think, building on what Sara was saying, people in positions of power haven't had to listen, so change hasn't happened. And COVID has highlighted and heightened many inequalities, and I know if you'd had those statistics up, Ruth, we would have had them all at our fingertips. But I think lockdowns have given some people time to amplify the message that they want heard around inequality, and others of us have had space to listen, to pause and reflect, and even plan to take action. So it's a unique opportunity, and it really feels to me like, if not now, when, in terms of community foundations acting.
I think I hear a common thread between what you just said, Jen and Sara, just around the need for accountability, around why we're having a conversation such as this at a time such as this, is because erstwhile, although these issues were very real, many leaders have not had to be accountable. They haven't had to answer questions. But now, with the compounding issues that COVID has brought, we are all having to answer those questions, because the imperative for change systemically and institutionally has become more real than ever. And speaking to that, Jen, I heard you say that you will be speaking from a pragmatic place. And as someone who's been through everything, it sounds almost like, name it, been there, bought the t-shirt, and I can talk about it. Would you be able to speak to some of the current realities that you see Maybe just touching on some themes around governance and around policies that govern, that guide the day-to-day work across some of the community foundations that you may be familiar with, and yours, of course, more specifically. How would you say you've seen biases, conscious or unconscious, come to play in those policy, process, and practices, and what implications do these have for equity and inclusion?
Well, first I've got to say that we are very much on the bottom rung of the ladder on this journey, where we're just as an organization taking those first steps. So I'm not speaking as an expert in that we've got this all figured out and we've got all the policies and practices in place. And that's why I signed up for this webinar. I was really looking forward to hearing what the experts had to say. So just want to make that clear. So when I think about the reality of charities generally, one of the big things that they have to contend with in some respects is working with a volunteer board. And there's power structures there between board and staff, or board and within the boards themselves. And they're all individuals who come from different places. Some are very passionate and knowledgeable about the charities they serve, others not so much. Some boards have healthy power dynamics internally and others don't. Some of those individuals might be able to name their biases, others might not even have a clue what you're talking about when you talk about unconscious bias. So I think just realizing that it's not just one or two people, there are a whole cast of characters who, for each charity that have to be brought along on this journey, and their points of view have to be taken into consideration. And so it's quite a machine that you have to move forward on an issue. And so just locally, it seems to me that the organizations that are making the most headway on issues of equity and inclusion, not necessarily community foundations, but other organizations, are ones that are being very deliberate about articulating their vision and their values in respect of inclusion. And it means that the board members and staff all know what kind of organization it is that they're working for, and they can proceed accordingly. So I think that's a really important building block. And it seems to me that all of that internal work takes time to bring everybody along, unless we're going for a revolution and going to do it overnight. And that must be incredibly frustrating for the people who are sitting on the outside of equity and inclusion, to watch that, because it may just seem like so much navel gazing. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I really want to pick up on that and talk about what are some of the themes, what are some of the trends that you're seeing emerge. But maybe we'll just hear from Sara quickly on that same subject of what is the current state? What have you seen in your experience with the Community Foundation movement?
Sure, I'll build on some of the things that Jennifer said. So, I observe community foundations really grappling. They're looking at their governance, their staff, their organizational culture, their policies, their practices. In the grant-making sector, I think we have a few very concrete things to talk about and address. We need to talk about the origins of wealth and foundation wealth, and what systems and structures our wealth comes from, and how that plays out in terms of inequality and injustice. We need to talk about the location of our decision making, and Jennifer touched on that. Its connection to people who are the subject of oppressions, who has leadership, and who has access to solutions and levers for change. We have choices to make about where we aim our capital. Is it towards projects and programs that sort of backfill on inequality and injustice? Or is it on opportunities that really bend the arc of society? To bring it down to a level in our practices, a few things that tend to show up in organizations: there's hiring and recruiting people for our teams, for our governance and committees that we know, whose backgrounds and life experiences are the same as our own. And, you know, if I can reflect personally for a second, I do recall, you know, being part of a hiring process about a decade ago and interviewing 2 candidates. And in the kind of after chat with the other person who was doing this hiring with me, actually sort of expressing a preference for one of the candidates because she fit in our organization. And I realized in retrospect, you know, what I meant was her cultural references, where she had grown up, what she looked like, her accent fit with the other people in the organization. And I realize now what a profoundly wrong approach to hiring that was. We fundamentally don't trust the leadership and expertise of community organizations and leaders. And we really do, for the most part, and this is changing happily, run our organizations in ways that are designed for a certain kind of staff member, you know, notably for the most part, white men. So there's really a lot of stuff to grapple with.
Sarah, what I just heard you talk about while we're on the subject of bias and what that looks like, you just described what we call within my space and community, and I think in large use, affinity bias. The need to try to fit people into a certain mold, the need for it to be a cultural fit. And if we're reflecting, since we're on the subject of reflecting on personal experiences, I would also share from mine and my own connection to the Community Foundations movement. So as Tracy did read earlier in my bio, I migrated here from Nigeria in 2015, and I just came here to study. Wasn't at the time, had no plan whatsoever to stay in Canada or to make a home here. And then I did some volunteer work in the community, worked with refugees. The Syrian refugees were just coming in at that time. Got involved with community. And as part of my master's program, I needed to do a co-op program. And then I heard about this organization called the Victoria Foundation. Coming from where I was coming from, we didn't have organizations such as the Victoria Foundation and the pivotal role that it plays in the community. So it really piqued my interest. And what I did, knowing that, I didn't know too much about them. I didn't know anybody who works there, but I needed something and I thought that I could contribute something. So I literally showed up one day and said, my name is Ruth Mojeed. I am a student over at Royal Roads. I would like to learn this, and that. And these are the things that I'm hoping I can contribute within this context. And thankfully, although there were no opportunities that were open at that time, they'd never done anything like that in terms of bringing an intern on. Sandra Richardson, who is the CEO over at the Victoria Foundation, she invited me for a conversation, let's talk about how we can make this happen. And that one decision to bring someone whose experiences, Canadian experience or the lack thereof, wasn't expected to fit within the molds of, what the typical workplace would look like. The kind of experience that I was bringing, that decision to give me a chance in that room was what sealed my decision to stay in Canada. And every time I reflect on that journey, every time I look at how someone moved away from whatever biases could have come into play. Oh, you didn't start, your undergrad wasn't here. You probably don't know some of the running jokes and themes in the lunchroom and whatnot. Just getting past that. For me, that's what has really sealed what my journey has been with the Community Foundations movement. I'm excited to be doing even more work through the Victoria Foundation and others at this time. But what you described, Sarah, sadly, that's been all too often for a number of people who look, sound, or bring experiences that are very similar to mine. Very often, that's usually the situation, not what I have just described. Sarah, Jennifer, going back to what you were saying about modeling and some of the themes and trends that are coming from other organizations. And I want to believe you're referring to grassroots community organizations that are the forefront of the change. Are you able to speak to some of the specific themes that you're seeing come through?
think in terms of themes that I'm seeing in Peterborough, it would be there are many of these grassroots type organizations or just smaller charitable organizations running in a Peterborough kind of way. The idea of peer advocacy or peer support in all different shapes and sizes, depending on what the work is that the charity is doing, seems to be a very strong theme. So there's a lot of work happening in different guises about building up networks of people whose voices are stronger when they're joined or supported by others. And that's a sort of a long-term approach at building human capacity, not just the organizational capacity of the charities, but of the people they serve. So we're seeing it particularly in organizations that work with low-income groups, where they're providing the knowledges and resources and tools and even technology to help people bridge the gap. That seems to be a theme. So it's a little bit of sharing expertise and knowledge and sharing power. And I think acknowledging power is very important. And you were alluding to that a minute ago too, Ruth, that I think because of the power community foundations have relative to local charities we fund, we have a lot of scope to not be accountable. As long as we keep granting money to a wide range of good causes, nobody's going to say too much against us, at least not publicly, in case future grants are jeopardized. So we have a responsibility to raise the subject of power and to talk about equity and inclusion and to maybe facilitate some safe spaces, or even just to say, maybe it's better if we're not part of this conversation. Here, we'll put you together and we'll support it, but talk about us behind our backs, if you will, so that honesty can emerge. And I very much, it's a daily practice of conversations with those people and addressing this. I think for us, a lot of that sharing power and trying to flatten the gap is through our grant making. And we've been experimenting with participatory grant making in different ways for the past 15 months or so. And that ranges from asking for feedback on application forms before a grant call, to the grant recipients themselves peer reviewing applications and allocating the dollars. Ideally, I do all our granting this way, but it is a lot of work, and maybe because we're just learning, but most likely because it is time consuming to let everyone's voice be heard and incorporated into a process in a meaningful way. We're also doing a lot more outreach to deliberately connect with groups that we haven't heard from directly before, and that's quite a wonderful learning journey.
Right. Thank you. A number of things you gave us to reflect on there, and some of those I really want to pull right out, like talking about power and power dynamics and the need to share that. But before we get to that, you also spoke about some of the long-term commitments. We know that if we're talking systemic change, we're talking institutional change, if we're talking about overhauling policies and practices and cultural norms and nuances within organizations, that's not something you do within it just doesn't happen. It takes time. And I'm wondering, in your own reflections, what are some of the pre-preparation work that you think is needed for us to get to that point where we're starting to see shifts within systems and within institutions? Sara, do you want to?
Yeah, I can reflect on that. I think you're right, of course, Ruth, that this isn't a switch you flip. In my observation, the first and foremost important step for individuals and for the organization is to really do the inner work of considering, observing, and problematizing your own privilege as a settler, a white person, a man, whatever privilege you hold, and really grapple with that, not as a critique or an attack, but simply as a reality for which you have an accountability and an ability to work against. The key barriers are defensiveness and an unwillingness to be uncentered or to be decentered, and a lack of personal openness to be part of change. I think if you haven't really done that work, which isn't itself a switch, it's an ongoing conversation with yourself, but there's plenty of amazing things you can read and watch and listen to. But to get comfortable with the idea of yourself, as having a position by virtue of your status as a settler, whether you're Indigenous or not, whether you are racialized or not, whether you present as a man or a woman, whether you're transgender, and just understand that that positions you in a certain way, and then accept that you then have steps to take if you want to be accountable for that and combat that. Just that alone is actually maybe the most important thing, and quite a bit of ongoing work. Something that I have a moment, actually fairly frequent moments, where my own privilege as a white person becomes quite apparent to me. I think about it when I send my kids off to school and trust that teachers will treat them fairly. I think about it when I get, pulled over for speeding by the police, and I certainly don't want to get a ticket, but I'm not concerned that I'm going to be treated aggressively. And funnily enough, I think about it often, when you're leaving a grocery store and you've had a million groceries and you're kind of wheeling out of the store after waiting in line for a really long time, and you notice that you left the toilet paper under your cart and didn't put it on the conveyor belt and pay for it. And you have a split decision to make about, do I go back in and get in line and pay, or do I just keep walking? And I'm not saying I do this often, but I generally just keep walking because I trust, and only at the big box stores, I trust that nobody was watching me, nobody was suspicious of me. And if they did see me, they're gonna believe me when I go, oh, I didn't know, and there won't be any consequences. So I think, if you start to notice things like that, all the privilege you have, you can start to do the work of opening yourself to really fighting injustice and sharing power.
You put it in hearing it from you. Thank you for describing the day-to-day realities of a number of people that I know, and some of those experiences that there are tons of books that tons of pages that I could be reading from, but thank you for doing the work to reflect on some of the privileges that on a day-to-day basis, consciously or unconsciously, are handed to many of us in different ways. But going back to the subject of accountability and how we're keeping power holders accountable, I honestly do think that the first reflections at the beginning of our conversation today, even if we're just stopped there, we've done quite a bit. Just speaking to, I believe it was Jen who mentioned how the reason we're still having this conversation such as this, in spite of what the numbers and figures say, the reason we're still having conversations such as this is because historically, traditionally, power holders have not been kept accountable. In our work, in our roles as power holders, and maybe to some extent power sharers as well, what deliberate efforts are we making at the individual level to start to ensure that we're centering new voices, we're empowering new experiences, and really starting to help to change the face of leadership as is needed? Jen, do you want to?
Yeah, I think just building on what I was saying earlier about our grant making opportunities, certainly last year a big push with, for instance, the Emergency Community Support Fund grant. And we had all those weekly webinars and things that were rolling out, and everything was crazy busy, but trying to assemble people for our review panel that were very deliberately sort of sought out and recruited to be part of that, people whose voices we hadn't heard from, people who not that they represented any community or group, but they had an experience with that perspective. Rather than always looking to our board as the people that make these decisions, is a very deliberate attempt to shift power. That's why grounding some of our granting practices in a participatory model seems to work, because then it's the grant recipients themselves who are making decisions. And I'd love to see that extended to them bringing in some of the people they serve into the decision-making process. So it's sort of not trickle down grant making, but that there is a wider net being spread. And I think as community foundations, we say our purpose is to build a vital community for everyone here in Peterborough, and who is everyone, and how do we incorporate their voices. So again, it's deliberate choices every day. But I liked what Sara was saying about that soul searching that we have to do internally, both as individuals and as organizations. And again, that speaks to bringing a board along on a journey with all the members of the board committed to doing that soul searching themselves, so that they can bring that to the institutional table to shift then the organization forward. It's work.
Sorry. Thanks, Jen. And I just want to say before Sara reflects, I'm sure I want to hope there's someone in the room today who's going, all of that sounds really, really nice in an ideal world, but what if you run into issues? What if you run into roadblocks? Then what do we do then? And I would want to come back to that. But Sara, in your own view, how do we keep power holders accountable?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really notice as I'm spending time with the Equality Fund, which, as I said, is explicitly a values-led feminist funder of feminist movements around the world and women's rights organizations, is that when inside the team we come to big decisions, the first question that gets asked is, what will the feminist movements and women's rights organizations that we fund think of this? So they are really seen as the first, not the only, but the first stakeholder, not the funders, not the staff team, but really there's a clear articulation of where the priority lies and who we understand to be the agents of the change we're trying to make in the world. I think as organizations, we can, and again, in the frame of accountability, ask ourselves different questions to understand our strength, our progress, and our impact. Does our community foundation's leadership reflect the community that we're in? Do all members of the community know us and trust us? Do we attract interest and excitement from women, from LGBTQ+ members, from racialized people, from Indigenous peoples? The first year that I worked at the Toronto Foundation, I was a program officer and I was running one of the grant programs, and I'm really dating myself here, but we used to set up a box in the entryway of the office, and people used to, on the deadline day, of course, bring in 2 stapled copies of their grant applications. And, on those days, I used to sometimes bring in some cookies for all these harried people running in at 5 minutes to 5. And the people would deposit it in their box, and I would kind of sit in the entryway of the foundation offices. And I remember at the end of one of the days, we hit deadline, 5 o'clock, let the last couple stragglers in. And I had a big pile in the box. I think I had about 100 applications, and I knew, because I had done the math, that we were probably only going to be able to make 10 to 15 grants. And I was already feeling the weight of how many no's there would be. That's the problem with seeing people face to face when they drop it off. And I remember my manager at the time was really surprised at my reaction, and she was just lit up. She was so happy. And I said, well, why are you so happy about this? And she said, because this means 100 different organizations know about us, want to do business with us, and trust us. And so for her, this was really a sign, although she too wished we wouldn't have to decline so many, that the Community Foundation was making progress in its visibility and relationship with a large number of organizations across the community. And I thought that was really interesting and a kind of aha moment for me.
And I just was taking some notes there. I heard you say trust, 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 like it was the one thing that kept jumping right at me. I heard Jen talk about it too. And I'm wondering, before we go back to the question around difficult, unideal situations, how are we guarding these trust relationships that we seem to be saying we're building with communities, particularly the ones that have been most impacted by some of the inequities that we're talking about? How are we guarding this trust? How are we ensuring that there is, again, accountability in how their voices and experiences are being represented? Essentially, I'm asking, how are we doing better in terms of building trust and relationships? Sara, do you want to speak?
I was gonna kick that one to Jen to go. Let me just think about this one for a second. You know, what's coming to mind, Ruth, is courage. So one practice, an experience that I've actually had at CFC that I have found really valuable in terms of building and maintaining trust is when we embark on new things, we sometimes write down, or I sometimes write down for myself, a set of values around that. You know, who is most important in this? What are we trying to achieve? So to give a concrete example that links over to something you were speaking about earlier, Ruth, you know, I had the opportunity a number of years ago to be at the center from CFC's perspective of our deployment of the Welcome Fund, which was some funding we had in partnership, you know, to roll out in partnership with community foundations to welcome the wave of refugees arriving from Syria. I'm losing time, but I feel like that must have been about 6 years ago now, maybe even more, around that.
6, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, we had a lot of rapid and difficult program design decisions to make. And one of the things I kept coming back to, which, you know, was not perfect, but I think really helped us, was that we had written down somewhere that the most important thing in all of our program decisions was do what's best for refugees. And so every time we came to a crossroads in a program decision where, you know, is it too fast, too slow, you know, more difficult for us as CFC, more difficult for community foundations, you know, the corporate donors don't like it as much, the government doesn't like it as much, you know, like you're just overweighed with considerations and stakeholders, to be able to come back and say, who are we really serving here? Whose lives are we trying to make better? And who are we in the most important relationship with? And to have written it down, refugees, really gave us courage, I think. And I, you know, I don't hold that program up as the best example ever of relationship building or trust, but I think that practice of being authentic and explicit in your values, and then using that to be courageous in valuing those relationships and making decisions that are in service of those values. Again, it's not an amazing answer, but it's a tactic I see and use that works well.
That's awesome, Sarah. And I didn't ask that question with an expectation. We've arrived at that finish line, right? So everything we're able to articulate, like, so that's just awesome. And I'm hearing you talk about that, and I'm thinking too around how this talk about trust, this thing called trust, is a two-way traffic. And I'm seeing myself as a member of a community that historically has been marginalized, excluded, betrayed, or whatever other boxes we want to check there. And as someone who's working really closely with the Community Foundations movement as well, I'm just thinking around how there's got to be quite a bit of work to do. You spoke to authenticity in re-representing that authenticity. There is quite a bit of work to be done in how we're showing up humbly and deliberately as allies, as co-builders, as co-creators of solutions, and knowing and respecting too that the real solution, the real answers lies with the people with the lived experience, lies with the people whose problems we're trying to solve. And it's showing up humbly to work with them and let them be the experts in telling us, letting us be the expert in saying how we want to be served. So Jennifer, did you have some reflections on that, or do you want to go straight to the question around running into strongholds within systems?
Well, I can go from one to the other. I think I jotted down the word humble while Sara was talking as well, and you've echoed it there, Ruth. I think it's also is definitely coming at that from a place of humility, but especially when you get something wrong, is just to put up your hand and say, I screwed up, or we got that wrong, and acknowledging that, and having a conversation about it if necessary, and learning from it and moving on, because nothing's perfect and we're not perfect, and to try to set ourselves up as if we are perfect and know everything is that's wrong foots us right from the start, I think. So I screw up all the time, I'm happy to admit.
Yeah, totally. And on the question of what are some of the challenges that you've run into, maybe moving from the specificities of it, how do you handle these challenges where you are showing up as an ally, as someone who's trying to be very deliberate about, hey, this is the direction that we've got to go, for us to kind of tip the scale and balance things out. These are some of the shifts. And as a leader within the group, within the organization that you represent, what are some of, again, moving away from the what's, but I would ask it in the form of what are some of the challenges that you run into, and how, more importantly, do you walk around those?
So many challenges to choose from. I think picking up on a word that Sara used in her last response, courage, I think that's really important. And if I choose, Sarah's chosen her little shoplifting example, I'll choose a personal example too. As we're preparing for today's talk and leading the group locally working in the Gender Equality Fund, I'm also negotiating a new contract for myself in my new role. And there's a clause in that agreement in the draft, the first draft that came through, that says I'm supposed to keep the details of my compensation to myself. So as much as I want to just sign the contract and get on with things and not annoy our board, I know that lack of pay transparency is one of the big drivers of the gender pay gap we see across the country. So I can't, in good conscience, just go with that. And at the same time as I'm having this conversation, I have to take the risk of flagging this and addressing it with our board and saying, no, I'm not happy with this clause. I can't sign the contract with this in it, and this is why. So it's like personal risk, and here I am talking about it on a national webinar, and I haven't signed the contract yet. So, but it's little tiny steps like that, right? That's just one example where you just have to walk the walk. And whether it's because it affects your own paycheck, or because it affects the reputation of your organization, or because it is the right thing to do with an organization that you're funding. It's, so many times every day, every week, we're faced with these things, and it's you have to draw the energy from somewhere, and goodness knows we're all short of energy after a year of COVID, and a lot of us have it's just been go, 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 no time to pause or reflect, and we just have to develop good instincts on these things. But we have to, take a breath and say, no, I have to challenge whatever the status quo is here and be brave enough to step forward into whatever that next space looks like.
Absolutely. And just hearing you say that, what I'm thinking about is, just because maybe we're talking about unconscious issues and biases, and maybe not as much the conscious ones, just because they're unconscious does not mean they would be comfortable. Does not mean that the shifts and everything, the levers that we need to have in place to start to shift them, does not mean that that process in itself would be easy. And that's just great. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. As we're wrapping up this session, because just very mindful too, and I would encourage everyone kindly, if you have some questions, please do share them in the chat. We will be looking to them. I'm thinking around measurement. It's great that we're moving in certain directions and we have nice prospects and the intentions and all of that. But to ensure that the generations coming after us are not having to pick up on maybe some of the work that's already been done, or things that grounds that we're hoping to cover too. How do we ensure that we're measuring as we go along? How do we ensure that we keep coming back to the starting point and trying to see, hey, how far have we come from the starting line? Sara, do you want to?
Sure. In the last answer I gave, I sort of incorporated some of the ways that I think we can see and measure progress. Does our community foundations staff and governance and committees, and does it reflect the community we're in, and the organizations and leadership we're trying to support? Do all members of our community know us and trust us? Do we attract interest and excitement from all members of the community? I think some of the other questions we can ask ourselves are, are we situating ourselves as institutions and as individuals in the real world context that we're in? It's really easy, and I do it too, to get really wrapped up in your own organization's growth and sustainability. But are you really kind of stepping outside and understanding your community foundation in the broader context of your community, your province, your country, the world, and taking actions that are, in respect of that context, not just centering your institution? Have you really done the work on your own ego and examining your own privilege and changing yourself? And, are you noticing how easy it is to swim in the status quo waters in terms of power? Whose emails do you reply to first? Who do you follow on social media? Are donors your most important stakeholder? Is your organization authentic in supporting people's lives outside the office in their caretaking roles? Maybe I'll just close and say, again, one of the things that I'm observing and really appreciating at Equality Fund is to bring it back to the theme of gender equality, is to what extent there is a normalization and an openness about the role that many, if not all, team members have as caregivers of children, of partners, of parents. And that, I think we all see those memes on the internet of, the person who's kind of, well, a bit like we are today, trying to look presentable in the webinar, but then when you sort of screen out, there's like a child in a seat beside them and piles of laundry and stuff. And I think that, it's funny, I laugh at it too, but I think if as organizations, we can lower the barriers on having to pretend that you're not, a person who has someone else taking care of the kids, or a person who has someone else taking care of the house or parents, or and instead be authentic in the complex and intersectional roles that we're bringing to the workplace. If you catch yourself sort of trying to hide that, or you catch your team members trying to hide that, it's a sign, I think, that your organization hasn't done the work of letting people really, be their, not just their true selves, but actually just reflect the complexity of our society, that people have more than one dimension, and that work does need to be balanced, particularly through a feminist lens, with the other roles and responsibilities that people, and let's be explicit, mostly women, shoulder.
Wow, that's a lot in there. And then I want to, Jen, did you have some reflections, or I'm just gonna jump. Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say great questions that you put out there, Sarah. I'll have to listen to the webinar and write them all down. But I was just going to think on the global context, and one thing that's sort of common is the SDGs. We can't, one little community foundation, fix gender equity, but the SDGs, the number 5 is trying to address that. So maybe adding some questions in terms of our own barometer that align with that would be useful. And how does our organization measure up when it comes to, say, women's full participation, equal opportunities in leadership, and looking at community foundations? Is there how many women are leading community foundations across the country, and is there a gender pay gap between male and females doing the same roles at different community foundations? So that's just one thing. And also the questions that you posed in your presentation a few weeks ago, Ruth, I would love to see incorporated into part of our annual survey, our board survey that we do. Have everybody's ideas been heard, and whose ideas aren't being taken seriously? Like how those ones that really speak to inclusion and justice. I think those are very valuable questions. And in terms of our work with our grant partners, one of them recently suggested a medicine wheel approach to evaluation and measuring outcomes. And it takes some time to kind of get my head around that, but I'd love to explore that more because it's a very holistic approach.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm very pleased to let you know today that I came armed with that slide again today, because it's one of the major challenge that I have for people. And Tracy is handling things now, so I'm sure it'll cooperate with her. But just speaking about that, while she's pulling that up. Okay, so the next slide, please. Yes, this is the one. Talking about there is no conversation around institutional change without starting it with an I. And of course, I'm just going to read it out around diversity. For instance, would ask who's in the room, and equity responds who is trying to get in the room but who can't. Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure. Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority. Diversity asks, how many more racialized women do we have this year than last year? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as a perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice responds, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views? Those were some of the earlier reflections that I wanted us to have at the beginning of this conversation, but I'm glad that the conversation so far is really taking us through all of this. And of course, the expectation is not that we'll have all of the right answers. And Brenda, yes, we will be sharing the slides after now. The expectation is not that we'll have all of the answers right away, but that we are starting that journey towards getting to where we need to be, to building inclusive, equitable, and just systems and processes. And on speaking to the last few questions, I will be picking on some of the ones that came before the session. And Jen, I heard you talk about this particular one that I was going to ask, like with some of the data and figures and numbers and all of that that's coming out around the pandemic and the impact that it's had on particular groups, as has been mentioned, work that any one organization can do on its own. The need for collaboration and for partnerships has become more important, more relevant now than ever. How is the CFC sharing space? How is the CFC sharing learnings and co-building with others in this movement? Jen, I heard you speak to some of the learning that there is still to be done with organizations at the grassroots. But talking about cross-sectoral partnerships and collaborations, how are we seeing that come through? And if they're not coming through as yet, why should they be coming through, and what should they look like? Jen, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm very grateful to CFC for providing this sort of space to so that we don't all have to be reinventing the wheel. And I think that's absolutely essential. And certainly when we move into the more practical elements of doing this, whether it's the gender equality work or any of the work around inclusion and so on, I think having people working together to address different policies, to understand how to look at policies with a gender lens. We're not all GBA plus experts when it comes to analyzing things. So what exactly does that mean? And these are all kinds of questions I know I'm anxious to hear more about in the next session. But I think then being able to have a space to work together and share ideas is really important.
Thanks, Jen. Sara, any thoughts?
Maybe just add a couple quick thoughts, which is I think obviously forums like this and so many others are really important. I am aware and applaud that CFC has also been creating spaces for foundation leaders or staff members or board members of color can connect with each other. And I think that's really important. I would maybe make a couple suggestions for things that are going on that are really exciting. The first one is that I observe a lot of work going on, and it's happening at CFC and elsewhere around really tracking where our money goes, which organizations and whose leadership is the recipient of grants. That has been really carefully done through programs like the Emergency Community Support Fund. And I see us pushing out further to really understand the distinction between serving and led by, and be thoughtful about where our grant making practices are resourcing organizations that may serve Indigenous people or may serve racialized people, but are not actually led by them, and really paying attention to that distinction. Also want to talk about quickly two really exciting things that I've seen and I know others have seen in philanthropy. One is areas where racialized communities, and I would mention in particular Indigenous people and Black people, are stepping up with new initiatives. I would name in particular the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, and maybe even more excitingly, the Foundation for Black Communities. If folks haven't seen a really exciting announcement last week that two private foundations, the In Spirit Foundation and the Laidlaw Foundation, announced capital contributions to start to build the endowment of the Foundation for Black Communities. So it's not a grant, it's actually a shift in the endowed resources of the foundation to this new Black-led, Black-serving foundation. And I think while we have all this work to do, and that's what we've been talking about today, and growing and shifting and changing our own institutions, we also need to be paying attention to and sharing power and resources with emergent institutions that don't need to do all this change work, because they are different power, they are new power. And I think that's a super exciting opportunity for all foundations in Canada to consider, while we're doing all this work of shifting ourselves, can we also be making quite radical steps to build up these alternative institutions that are critical in the landscape?
And I think I heard quite a bit too around the self-governing nature of these organizations, where the solutions are coming from them and we're coming alongside them as partners and co-creators. And I think the final place that I would kind of want to hinge things, or maybe this would be the one leading to the last one, is around the commitment to continuous learning. So the slides that failed me earlier, some of the tips that I had around how we can check those biases, just around the commitment to self-education. As someone with lived experience, there's only so much that my words can convey or can carry around the labor, sometimes unacknowledged, unspoken, unpaid labor that a lot of people from my community carry the burden to educate or to stand in the space and bridge the gap and all of that. And even a system such as that, a structure such as that needs to shift drastically for us to start to see change. And so this is kind of an invitation for each and every one of us to walk side by side, people with lived experience, people with the grounded expertise in the issues that concern them, and to do some work and make a commitment to learning. Some of the organizations that we're working with here on the West Coast, part of the conversations we're having around intercultural competency and building all of the right skills and getting past knowing what you don't know, essentially, is around even things like our budgetary allocation. How are we making that commitment, like making a specific deliberate place in our budgeting and financing to ensure that we're making tangible commitments to learning in the long run. Sessions such as this, understanding what are some of the literacy gaps that we have, and you really don't know what you don't know. And sometimes it takes someone who's walked those shoes, who knows where it pinches, to tell it to you. And can I just say, I like to say this in just about every room that I'm in. When you find someone who's speaking from a place of lived experience, a racialized people, any other equity-seeking group, but I want to say in particular, Black or Indigenous people, when they tell you, these are my experiences, this is how I feel about certain things, please believe them. Yes, you may be going through whatever journey in terms of understanding or trying to contextualize within the space of what you know, but please first seek to believe, seek to understand. opportunities to have discussions. So stepping out of whatever our own comfort zones would be. Again, I'm going back to the whole idea of just not knowing what you don't know, except someone is calling it out to you and saying, hey, this is what it is. For someone in my shoes, sometimes we all have our blinders that kind of sideline us from certain issues. Being an ally, as an organization, as an institution, as individuals, as community members, I can't even stress this enough. But there are all sort of considerations and contexts around what allyship means. But in this case, I'm talking about being an ally in such a way as this is not your journey. This is not it is not your journey. You have a very personal or unique journey as an ally now in within this context in contributing to the solution. But of course, it's centering the voices and experiences and the perspectives of the people that this concerns the most. For me, those are some of the ways that we can check our biases, and also it's how we can make a continuous effort to doing better at this. Sarah, Jen, do you have some quick tips on your end around how we can do better in terms of reinventing and continuing to learn? Anybody can go first.
Quick tips. No, I think that's your area of expertise,
Yes,
Ruth.
it is. Definitely bringing you into the spotlight on this. I want anybody who's listening right now to know that yes,
Yeah.
there are different. There is grounded expertise, there is allied expertise, and each of us brings something to that table. So please, whatever comes to mind within your own context, please feel free to share.
Yeah, no, it's a continual process, this checking your bias. Just looking at this slide while you're talking, Ruth, it's something that we all have to do all the time. And then when you've got an intersectional or an intersection in something, it's being aware of seeing those intersections and navigating yourself in that space. So we're talking about gender equality today, and so you can say, oh well, I'm a woman, I'm qualified to talk about that. But then there are other places where there are other women with maybe racial or they're Indigenous or gender identity isn't quite so clear, that those are all spaces. It's not quite the same as me, right? So it's easier said than done. And I know when Tracy asked me to be part of this, I'm like, well, I don't know anything. And it's like, well, actually, I'm a woman. I can at least do that piece. So, but being aware that that's just the tip of the iceberg. So.
Thanks, Jen. Sarah, any thoughts?
Well, maybe I'll just add really quickly to what Jennifer said to say, I think if you want to really lean into to this stuff, practicing feeling, there's a buzzword we use, the discomfort, which I don't actually like very much because it's such a neutral word. But I think practicing being in spaces where you feel yourself not being looked to as the expert, you feel your power being questioned, you understand that the expertise and the momentum and the leadership is elsewhere, and just sitting in that feeling. I think often, as particularly for white people in the foundation sector, we are so accustomed to having the power that when we don't have it, we think there's something, it's not a good meeting, or it wasn't productive, or something seems to have gone wrong. But I think sometimes that's just the feeling of not being automatically important or automatically powerful. And it's such an unfamiliar feeling. So I think get yourself into those situations and then just sit in them and feel that feeling of not being centered. It's actually if you're not used to it, it's a really helpful and challenging feeling.
But it can also be exhilarating and exciting when the power shifts, you know, creating these spaces, having those conversations, and when you let it go and turn it over to the other, like I've had that experience, and it is absolutely exhilarating. So yeah, maybe there's some discomfort, and it's not an easy thing to do, but there are rewards when it works. So it's worth the effort.
Totally and absolutely. So just this exercise we just did, me coming in, sharing as a person with lived experience, and both of you standing, sitting, sharing side by side around what we can all do as people that are concerned within this space. I think that this is what the core of this conversation today really is about. And as we're wrapping up this last bit of the conversation, I would just like to leave us with this quote, and it just goes without saying that it is time for an honest reflection on how institutional racism and unequal power structures impact the work we do, but beyond even the work, how it impacts our day-to-day lives. And I like to say that conversations don't do it all. They are a great, great way to start. But the real meat of this matter is in the actions that we take after now, and the commitment that we make to coming back to the drawing board, having these honest, uncomfortable conversations, safe conversations, if you may, brave conversations, always coming back to check our biases, always coming back to see what else is missing. But now is the time. There is no better time than now. The only time, of course, that would have been better is 10 years ago, or maybe even 100 ago. So thank you all so much for taking the time. Sara, Sara, thank you for sharing of your wisdom. Thank you for sharing from the learnings that you're doing at this time as well. I hope this has been a meaningful conversation for everyone. And with that, I would like to pass it over to Tracy.
Well, I have to say thank you, Ruth, Jennifer, Sara. You shared your authentic self in this amazing conversation. And you know, as you were going through today, there were so many pieces for all of us to bring forward in our journeys, from how we're continuing to learn, and we're on a journey, and it is a continued process. And there's more and more for us to do as we go forward. But it's important for us to be pausing, to listen, to ask the questions, to be honest, to be brave, and truly, as all of you were today, to be truly authentic. And so I thank you so much for joining us today and for being so caring and mindful in your sharing. Thank you from the Community Foundations of Canada movement, from all of the individuals that are with us today. Today is also as I mentioned at the start of today's session, it is one of two series. And so our next session, which is part 2, will be shared on April the 14th. And Ruth will be back with us at that time, when we'll start to get into some of the deeper pieces on policy changes and some of the other tools that we can use to help to move forward on a governance and board and relationships and systems processing. So I encourage you to join us for the next session, which will be on April the 14th. It will be up on our website shortly, but I have just shared the link for you in the chat box. So do grab that link before you sign off today. And as we leave today, thank you for all of you, what you do in your communities. You are making our nation what it is. It's kind, it's caring, it's thoughtful. And today, please use the tools that you've received today. Please use them as you go forward and continue to do amazing work. And so we will close the webinar for today, and we look forward to seeing you on April the 14th, if not before then. All the best, everyone.